Welcome to this week's edition of Chatting the Pictures. So, Michael, our first segment we call the news, and here we ask, how do news photos tell a story?
This week, this photo illustration, as opposed to a photograph, we pulled from Twitter. We don't have the original source, and it's also one of many variants that were illustrating the same idea. And these circulated on Twitter after news spread about the wildfires in the Amazon. That became a bigger issue when the French president got into a Twitter battle with the Brazilian president over his pro-development stance and his climate denial.
This image is a really great example of the power of a photo illustration as visual analogy, isn't it? That idea of the Amazon as the lungs of the planet. I can kind of track several analogies that build essentially here. So the first, you have the environment is like a body. The Amazon, this particularly important, special, unique natural environment, is like a body. And then by further analogy, it gets you to the idea that any illness and disease in the environment is akin to the illness and disease in the body. What's really interesting about that is because climate change is difficult to picture, what this photo illustration does is essentially make a kind of visual argument for human agency in terms of damaging the climate and the environment. Using cigarettes to set fire to your lungs, if you will, is the same kind of thing. So if people are to a certain extent at fault for smoking and damaging their lungs, which was the argument of those anti-smoking campaigns for many decades, then again, you've got that same analogy here that it's our fault. We're doing it to ourselves.
What's interesting is that if you followed the media after this 2 or 3 day surge, people posted pictures of the Amazon on fire. There was all kinds of abuse of truth, where the pictures that celebrities and also politicians posted, they were taken, maybe a decade ago. Then there was some refutation of the idea right now that the fires in the Amazon are caused by climate change. I think that the reason that this became such a catalyst for Twitter anger is because there hasn't been a focal point for climate change action. And this certainly gave us the opportunity.
And I think that caption on the bottom of that photo illustration hits at this idea of not just kind of who's to blame, but who's affected. So that idea of lost there, felt here in the context of an image of the Amazon as lungs is really compelling because it gets at that idea of a thing that seems far away and abstract over there actually hurts, the Earth's body in a way that an individual might feel. Our next segment we call The Look, and here we are interested in how news photographs push the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or an idea.
This photo was taken by Miguel Cabela for SIPA, and it shows a protester using a laser against riot police in Hong Kong. It was taken last month, but we're seeing many images like this being published right now. This photo is not an allusion to Target or Home Depot or even Lego. It's illustrating protesters combating the use of AI and facial recognition by the state.
There's all of these literally overlapping circles. You've got the makeshift shields that they're holding in front of them. You've got, in some cases, the circles of their eyewear. You've got the circular aspects of the helmets, something else they're using to both protect themselves and also hide themselves from surveillance. And then, of course, you've got that penetrating circle of the green light, which is pointed outwards, right, in a kind of combined mode of attack and defense, you might say. There's surveillance, but there's also a kind of aggressive resistance to that.
Yeah, the symmetry is really interesting. It parallels how much we're looking at asymmetrical warfare at this point. The protesters have been pointing handheld lasers at CCTV cameras. They're using them to confuse police officers. They're using them to scramble facial recognition cameras. They are also actually trying to prevent bystanders from shooting photographs, which then can get sourced by the police. And unfortunately, they're also damaging camera sensors from the photojournalists. So there's certain collateral damage taking place in terms of the reporting of their activity, but we're in a whole new territory now in terms of technological battle.
If you think about what social movements do to get attention, then that new territory becomes even more complex, right? Because the idea that you gather and protest in a place you're doing that partly because you want attention, but at the same time, the kind of attention that is being put on the protesters is not only unwanted, but in many cases dangerous. So yeah, it's this interesting push-pull between the desire to be seen and visible and to get your arguments out there and the need to protect yourself from the very surveillance that your position in the public streets is inviting.
I wonder if attention actually comes either way, though, with, like you said, these shields, the makeshift and very kind of domestic objects. You have unavoidably like a fashion statement. Then you also have the lasers themselves. And if you look at this and a lot of the other images that are being published right now, it really is kind of sexy stuff. The kind of this laser light show, even though it's like desperate and completely self-protective.
Our next segment we call the pick. And in this segment, we ask what makes a photo a good editorial choice among lots of options.
This was taken by George Frey for Getty Images. It shows a child's bulletproof backpack being tested in Salt Lake City. It was originally published in 2012 after the Sandy Hook massacre, and then NBC reran the photo reporting how none of the backpacks currently on the market would have stopped a rifle round from the El Paso or the Dayton gunmen, and that sales of these backpacks have gone up 300% since the two shootings. How's that for irony, Cara?
This photo is such a poignant illustration of where gun culture has brought us to. But for many of the reasons that you just stated, Michael, there's so many ways that this photograph is really deceiving, isn't it? The idea, I think, here being communicated, at least by people who are selling these things, is that this will protect your child. And there's evidence within the photograph itself that the kinds of mass shootings we see are not really the sorts of things that are depicted in the photograph. It's this very artificial scene that in one way is constructed to illustrate a potential solution to a very real and dangerous problem, but the pieces of the photograph together add up to, I don't know what to call it. Maybe this is also a kind of photo illustration.
Why can't we solve this? 7 years later, if anything, this picture's like this epic example of disaster capitalism. I didn't mention it also, but this is the CEO of the company. So it's not even someone who's field testing. So, it's just pure marketing. It's just about profiteering.
There's also an interesting gender component here. Although I personally think it's totally cool for young boys to carry whatever color backpack they want. A pink backpack with polka dots signals a feminine kind of color. And you have a white man the white men, in fact, are the people committing the gun crimes in a lot of these mass shootings. So you've got this interesting gender dynamic at play here too. And I think that's in some ways, part of the marketing, right? That your innocent child could be protected by this.
What's also interesting about this is the scale. A long lens will compress the distance between background and foreground. And when you look at this photograph, it looks like the backpack is almost the same size as this man's upper body. And how perfect that is, where our children have become these overarching and all too large targets.
And that really gets at, I think, the key point that this just looks like an image at a gun range, doesn't it? And so if nothing else, this is an image of, where we are. The NBC story pointed out that the ratings on a lot of these backpacks are not rated for the kinds of gun crimes that are actually happening in these mass shootings. And that if they were rated properly, a backpack like this would just be too heavy for the average child to carry around. And so you think then about how much weight, literally and metaphorically, does a small child have to carry around in, U.S. society today? That wraps things up for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.